standing around. So we decided that we needed to create an environment that may be not so conducive to be standing for a long period of time and having a conversation or having a smoke or something like that.
The library has a measured response to the music scientifically, but staff have observed a notable decrease in loitering.
Immediately, even the first day, there was hardly any people standing around.
The library's experimented with the volume.
Oh no. Never mind. You kind of get the idea from that of what I'm talking about. So, as this video kind of demonstrates, while its advocates claim remarkable effects of the effects of this kind of music as a means of dispersing people, of driving people away, it is unclear how precisely classical music inhibits crime and antisocial behaviour. There is the suggestion, and this is kind of one of the frequently repeated kind of phrases, that classical music has an inherently soothing effect, thus calming potential troublemakers. One perhaps more plausible hypothesis is that the music alleviates a fear of crime as opposed to actual crime. Indeed, Tom Yeoman, the spokesman for Nexus, related to the Tyne and Wear Metro again, states that even if the loiterers congregating in metro stations didn't have a violent agenda, quote, to other passengers they looked like they might have. The groups congregating in stations were felt to be menacing by other passengers, and so inhibiting their presence via music was understood to make the right clientele feel more secure. Either way, the policing and management of social space through such tactics, through the attraction of certain bodies and the repelling of others according to age and social status, can be thought of in Theo Kinsius' words, a form of low-intensity class warfare. The idea that music can be a mechanism of social and psychological control has a long history. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato, pictured here, proposed that certain types of musical styles, modes and instruments are beneficial or detrimental to a harmonious and well-ordered society. Simple music was understood to encourage temperance, grace and virtue, whilst music derived from complex rhythms, inappropriate modes, was a threat to an orderly society. It harboured the power to corrupt and inspired meanness, lawlessness and promiscuity. For Plato, then, the correct musical education was vital to the moral well-being of the social, insofar as, quote, rhythm and harmony sink more deeply into the mind than anything else and affect it more powerfully than anything else. For someone who is given the correct education, their product is grace, but the opposite situation, it is inelegance. The idea, so fast forward from antiquity to the earlier 20th century, when the Music Corporation began broadcasting ambient pipe music into the workplace, restaurants, elevators and shopping malls. Founded in 1934 by the American inventor Major General George Owen Squire, Muzak offered functional music that was designed to slip under the radar of direct conscious perception. Though barely noticeable, Muzak, it was claimed, could improve a listener's psychological disposition. Careful programming of this largely inaudible but affective background music was understood to boost employee morale and productivity. Central to the Muzak Corporation's success was its patented stimulus progression, which was believed to boost efficiency at periods of the day when workers are their least productive. It entailed programming music in 15-minute blocks, and over the course of 15 minutes, songs would become increasingly stimulating, providing a sense of forward movement and quickening pace. The stimulus value of each song was calculated according to factors such as rhythm, tempo, instrumentation, and orchestra size. The most stimulating song of the 15-minute block would be then followed by 15 minutes of silence. This was thought to prevent listener fatigue and ensure that the music remains unimposing. And so the idea was that assembly line workers would move in time to the Muzak, ensuring that productivity was kept at its peak. As Fordism morphed into post-Fordism, Muzak moved from the factory to the retail and service sector. With this, there was a shift in focus from the worker and worker productivity to the consumer and the creation of appropriate sales environments. Muzak was understood to create a pleasant sonic environment that could relax shoppers and encourage the transformation of shopping into buying. And with this, the pattern of deployment also changed. As a Fordist technology, Muzak was distributed uniformly from a central transmission point. However, with the rise of Muzak in consumer environments, there's come to be an emphasis on client programming control and specifically curated playlists. So, for example, Krispy Kreme Donuts has music to emulate a 50s diner. So like Muzak, the background classical music of Eldon Square bus station, the Tyne Wear Metro and Central Library is functional. It is tended to have a psychological effect rather than being a source of entertainment. Unlike Muzak, however, this background music is not primarily intended to soothe, calm and uplift, though this has been suggested as one effect, as I've pointed to. Rather, its principal function is to irritate, to drive out and exclude the everyday enemies of propriety. Furthermore, given its aesthetic blandness and banality, Muzak is often deemed to be exemplary of bad music, whilst the music that has come to be played at metro stations, library foyers and outside shops is that of the canonical greats, Mozart, Beethoven, Vivaldi, those names who often signify good taste and a cultured mind. So I'm going to stop the Muzak, as some of you might be pleased. So another, perhaps more obscure point of connection can be found between the contemporary weaponised use of classical music and the English folk custom of rough music. Occurring from the 17th century up until the 19th century, rough music, also known as rantanning, names a range of local traditions that involve a noisy procession or demonstration aimed at a person or people who have violated community norms in either a private or public context. Participants in rough music would make as much noise as possible, banging pots, pans and kettles, rattling bones and cleavers, ringing bells, blowing horns and reciting songs and rhymes. So these activities are apparent from an 1877 Lincolnshire dialect glossary, which defines rough music as, quote, a clashing of pots and pans, sometimes played when any unpopular person is leaving the village or being sent to prison. And this raucous cacophony was often accompanied by a dramatic element, mimetic reenactments of violations and the parading of effigies, which at the point of climax was sometimes burnt or drowned. Though the pretext to the enactment of rough music varied significantly, common transgressions involved issues of sexuality, reproduction, adultery, domestic violence, and breaches of a patriarchal domestic hierarchy by scolds, shrews, masterful or nagging wives, or alternatively, weak and submissive husbands who failed to uphold their patriarchal authority. And according to the historian E.P. Thompson, the satiric noise of rough music was an expression of community hostility, inducing shame and embarrassment. It belongs to, quote, a mode of life in which some part of the law belongs still to the community and is theirs to enforce. And E.P. Thompson is very careful to kind of warn against a kind of cosy nostalgia in seeing this kind of self-policing. At its most extreme, rough music served to drum out the disgraced, encouraging them to flee their home. However, E.P. Thompson also notes that the ritual element of rough music can be thought of as a channeling and controlling of hostility, serving, sometimes but not always, as a substitution for actual physical violence. And I find it interesting in this justification or this kind of substitution, this process of substitution for violence, we get a preemption of some of the justifications for sonic weapons and so-called no-touch torture practices, of which the use of sound and music have formed part of. I'm going to come on to those slightly later. But there's this point around, or this repeated point around sonic weapons and no-touch torture, where it's preferable to actual torture or actual violence or actual weapons. And that's seen as a legitimate reason for using them. So I want to suggest then that the weaponized use of classical music might be thought of as a contemporary manifestation of rough music, or more accurately, rough Muzak. As an audio-affective deterrent, classical music is used to irritate, annoy, and subsequently displace and drive out those who are suspected of threatening the moral and economic orders of late capitalism. And I'd like to conclude by considering the implications of this use of classical music as rough music, or what I'm proposing can be thought of as rough music, in relation to some of the traditional ideologies around classical music, which I'm sure are perhaps applicable to a wider art practice as well. So when deployed in this way, classical music loses something of its long-celebrated, transcendent, otherworldly status. I'd like to point out that's not a viewpoint that I necessarily subscribe to, but this again is kind of an important kind of rhetorical, discursive kind of placement of classical music. By existing as art for art's sake, classical music has been afforded, in discourse at least, a distance from the social and social function. Indeed, it is this ideology that has often provided classical music with its moral worth. Julian Johnson, for example, argues that classical music, insofar as it functions as art, is morally valuable in that it can communicate to us something fundamental about what it is to be human. So he states, being both physical and intellectual, classical music enacts the repeated exceeding of one another that is the condition for being fully human. Such encounters of transcendence go against a contemporary culture that, according to Johnson, devalues classical music insofar as it marginalises, quote, the intellectual reflective activity of the mind. In such a culture, classical music becomes an activity, this is another quote, an activity of the eccentric, peripheral, undervalued and highly comical. Classical music, he argues, like the activity of the mind more generally, is too articulate to be cool. So there is much to Johnson's argument that I take issue with. Yet for the moment I want to ask, can one continue to speak of classical music's innate moral worth when it is used as rough Muzak, when it is successfully deployed and intended to function as an irritant and a mode of displacement? And we can see a similar kind of debate going on in relation to the use of music as a method of so-called no-touch torture against captives held in Guantanamo Bay. And one of the kind of primary commentators on this has been Suzanne Cusick. And she states, and kind of echoes Julian Johnson in this, quote, we in the so-called West have long since come to mean by the word music an acoustical medium that expresses the human creativity, intelligence and emotional depth that we think almost lifts our animal selves to equality with the gods. When we contemplate how music has been used in the detention camps of contemporary wars, we find this meaning stripped away. We are forced instead to contemplate music as an acoustic medium for evil. The thing we have revered for an ineffability to which we attribute moral and ethical value is to be revealed as morally and ethically neutral, as just another tool in human beings' blood-stained hands. So I think that a similar revelation takes place when classical music becomes rough Muzak. When functional and weaponized, the maintenance of classical music's autonomy from social function and its subsequent innate moral worth becomes more and more untenable. Instead, it becomes embroiled in the micro-wars of the everyday, which, rather than occurring in torture camps and faraway lands, take place in shopping centres, public transport stations and library foyers. Thank you.
Right, sorry. Yeah, thanks. Just a quick comment. Before I moved to the UK, I noticed classical music being played in the indoor foyers of banks in North America. The sections where the bank itself would be closed, but you could still use the cash machine.
Yeah.
But I noticed this a while ago, and they were playing classical music and just loud enough to be kind of irritating.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it was just so obvious. You could just, that homeless, it was about homeless people and the idea that homeless people aren't supposed to listen to classical music.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just sort of throw that out.
Yeah, I mean, the class dynamics are really interesting. And for me, like, on one hand, I'm kind of interested in the kind of affective dimension of it, where it's being used as a mode of repelling people, but also the kind of symbolic value in using this music, the music that is meant to lift the mind to a higher register and has this very long ideological history tied to it and symbolic history, class history tied to it. The fact that it is so kind of blatantly being used as a weapon now, I think raises something really interesting and really troubling. I mean, when I first came across this, I was like, oh, this is like the whole like rhetoric around playing Mozart to babies in the womb will make them smarter, that kind of thing. And then like you kind of sat back and kind of thought about it and was like, this is really, really troubling and really, really sinister. I mean, kind of the micro-war level thing I find really troubling and uncomfortable. And I think that a lot of kind of classical music, what's been interesting for me is that a lot of the advocates of classical music have suddenly been confronted with this kind of very obvious and blatant kind of use of this music, and have kind of suddenly had to kind of contemplate, what does this mean? And what does it mean for them as kind of advocates of classical music? How has it affected busking? I'm not sure. I mean, my hunch would be the thing I said about kind of the London underground. I wonder if it's had a displacing factor. I'm not quite sure what the effect has been. In Newcastle on the Metro, they don't still play classical music on the Metro. I don't know why they stopped, actually. I'd really like to find out why. This is kind of the beginnings of a new research project, so I don't have lots of answers at the moment, but I'd really like to know why they stopped. But yeah, I wonder if it's had a kind of displacing effect on kind of buskers, and that again ties into a very long-standing narrative in music with the fear of replacing live musicians with recorded musicians.
Thank you for introducing all of us to the phrase rough Muzak. That's such a fantastic takeaway. You're probably aware that for the last 11 and a half months, the South Bank Centre in London has been the home to a festival called The Rest is Noise, exploring modern and contemporary classical music, as they call it, which as a phrase is also kind of interesting. And so your paper made me think a lot about the sliding scale, if you like, the bracketed continuum between music and noise, and how the deploying of, which is a generalized deploying of classical music in this way, which collapses all of the variable cultural distinctions, political connotations, religious connotations of Baroque music in general, whatever that may be, of Vivaldi, of Delius, and just puts it all into this soup.
Yeah.
I wonder whether it would be really interesting to have you speak a little bit more about that noise music sliding scale and its connection to value and deterrence and even ideas about pleasure and pain.
Yeah, so this is actually something that I kind of deal with in my thesis, and this is kind of jumping away from what I deal with in my thesis, and without kind of going into that too much, the way in which I understand noise is to have it, as you can probably guess from the kind of Beyond Unwanted Sound title, is to try and move beyond only thinking of noise in terms of unwanted sound. And the way in which I think of noise is in terms of a kind of disruptive function in many ways, and that's not necessarily a negative thing. So for me, the use of classical music is interesting in terms of noise, not only because it targets an individual body and it serves to irritate and annoy an individual and a subject, but also in that it is very explicitly against the formation of a collective or a crowd or the accumulation of bodies in a space. And it's intended to be disruptive to that formation as well, so the kind of gathering of bodies as well. And I find there to be something interesting in that. In relation to the kind of South Bank thing, this kind of play between music and noise is something that's really interesting to me. And one of the things that I really try and challenge is this purported opposition to music and noise. I'm kind of doing it from a slightly different kind of angle than this might suggest. But I think the kind of weaponized use of music really throws that into kind of question, you know, can we have this stable binary that, you know, a lot of the discourses around noise and noise music are still relying on. There is still a very binaristic mode of thinking that is being applied, a particular modernist narrative as well around noise and music that is still kind of being continued. I think the other place where that becomes explicit is, again, I was referencing kind of Suzanne Cusick's work on no-touch torture and kind of the use of music as a weapon and a torture device. And the kind of interviews that she has with some detainees is that it doesn't matter, or what is being suggested, because they say, you know, you can't hear anything. It's just kind of like a wall of sound. You can't tell what the music is. So the fact that we have these incredibly famous stories around them using Barney the dinosaur or Christina Aguilera, on one hand trivializes it. On one hand, it says, you know, and it makes it more familiar because we can say, oh, well, I know what it's like to be irritated by unwanted music. You know, I live in a city kind of environment. I have neighbours who play loud music. I can take it. And there's on one hand, a kind of reducing of the severity of that by making it familiar. On the other hand, because it is totally inaudible as music, it doesn't sound like music at all, you know, in a shipping container at the levels it's being played at, you know, you could play white noise and it would probably have a similar effect. The selection of music then is an ideological one, and it helps construct this kind of us and them narrative. But there is something interesting there that, from that perspective, any kind of music can be turned into noise.
Just to ask, in the vocabulary of our conference, do you think that the people are being intended to be disgusted or to cause pain?
With the mosquito device, it's painful. I'm 26 and I can still hear it. And it's unpleasant. You know, at that volume, it's unpleasant. They also, Compound Security Systems, the delightful company that they are, created a lower frequency device that was specifically designed against homeless people. And their kind of media kind of propaganda around it was that you can now target homeless people too. Brilliant. And the frequency is uncomfortable. It's really painful. And it's funny, we often don't think about sound in terms of pain necessarily, but it really is. It's that kind of piercing frequency. And again, at 108 decibels, that's loud. So you have this combination of high pitch and amplification that does make it very, very uncomfortable. And yeah, I mean, I guess how this relates to the theme of disgust, I was worried it was slightly tenuous, but there are kind of a lot of kind of nuanced connections going on. The theme of kind of loitering and those people deemed enemies or kind of bodies that are deemed to be a threat or kind of breaching a particular moral order or an economic order, I suggested, I think connects to what Imogen was saying about, you know, commons and the idea that people speaking in the street can be seen as kind of troubling or worrying or something that we want to repress. I also think the fact that these weapons, the way in which they work, which is funny given that I tend to think about sound and I kind of am quite critical of kind of an Occlea-centric kind of perspective, but it is an out of sight, out of mind kind of response, right? In that they are kind of trying to drive away people who aren't supposed to be visible in certain spaces. And so there is this whole rhetoric around, even if they even if they weren't causing trouble, they looked like they might do. And, our passengers didn't like that, they weren't meant to be seen. So I think the idea that it is built around driving people out, it is built around, or certainly the kind of rhetoric around it, is to do with kind of getting rid of certain bodies, getting rid and kind of moving them out of visibility, is really interesting.